4. Jonathan the Hasmonean. Jonathan as rebel leader. With the death of Judah Maccabee, it seemed that the efforts of the Hasmonean family to gain freedom for Judea collapsed. Those who had opposed the Hasmoneans gained influence and power. Religiously, too, there was a great change, for King Demetrius did not persecute Judaism, nor did Alcimus follow in the footsteps of his brother Onias Menelaus. The king was tolerant of the religious and the non-religious Judeans. Alcimus, while a Hellenist, did not entirely subvert Judaism. His followers, however, now had absolute power over the Judeans and used it to achieve their ends. Those who had followed Judah Maccabee, or were suspected of having been in sympathy with his aim to establish Judea as an independent state, were sought out and tortured to death, probably in order to obtain information concerning their friends and accomplices. But Judah Maccabee's intolerance toward Hellenism and his idea of political autonomy for the Judeans did not die out with him. Those few who remained loyal to the Hasmoneans elected Jonathan as their leader. When Bacchides learned of this, he was apprehensive lest Jonathan become a power in Judea, and so he sought to get rid of him. Jonathan fled with his group to the wilderness of Tekoa, which extends from the southeast of Bethlehem to the Dead Sea. All his belongings, including his cattle, were sent under the guardianship of his brother John to his friends the Nabateans across the Jordan. While on the road, John and his men were attacked by an Arab tribe, the Ambri, near the city of Medeba. John was killed, and all the property was captured. In return, Jonathan and his brother Simon crossed the Jordan and attacked the Ambri during a wedding celebration, killing many of them and recovering their property. Bacchides, upon learning that Jonathan was on the east bank of the Jordan, organized an army and followed him. He came upon his quarry on the Sabbath day, and thought that, because they were religious, they would not resist. However, Jonathan, like Judah, told his men they must fight in self-defense even on the Sabbath day, in the short scrimmage which took place between the two camps. Bacchides' men gained the upper hand. To save themselves, Jonathan and his men swam across the Jordan and fled into the wilderness of Judea in the south. Bacchides now had complete rule over Judea. Personal footnote. If anyone happens to be curious, the order to break Sabbath and defend themselves is halakha. You're allowed to do that by Jewish law. Back to it. In order to strengthen the position of the Seleucids in Judea, Bacchides fortified the citadel in Jerusalem. He also established a system of defenses against Jonathan by creating a line of fortresses from the northwest to the southwest of the city, with Jerusalem as their center. Thus he fortified the cities of Jericho and Emmaus, the gateway to Jerusalem, situated about 20 miles northwest of the city. He also fortified Bet-Horon, almost 12 miles northwest of Jerusalem, Bethel, modern Betin, about 12 miles north of Jerusalem, Timnath, on the border between Dan and Judah, about 12 miles northwest of Bet-El, Pherathon, modern Pherata, southwest of Shechem, Nablus, Tophon, about 3 miles west of Hebron, Benzur, about 20 miles south of Jerusalem on the road to Hebron, Gazara, 4 miles northwest of Jericho, Emmaus. He placed armed guards in all these fortresses. Further, to make certain there would be no revolt, he followed the practice of Rome and took the sons of the leaders of Judea as hostages, placing them in the citadel under guard. Judea was tranquil for a while. Bacchides' rule was firm. The aristocracy, who followed the high priest Alcimus, were in control of their countrymen, the Judeans. Jonathan and his men were in hiding in the wilderness of Judea. Hence they could not cause any disturbance. In the month of Iyar, in the spring of 160, the high priest Alcimus commanded that the wall of the inner court of the sanctuary be torn down. There were 3 courts in the temple: the court of the priests, the court of the Israelites, and the court of the women. A wall separated the Temple Mount proper, into which Gentiles were allowed to enter, from the inner court, where they were forbidden. Alcimus tore this wall down apparently to erase the distinction between Judeans and Gentiles, and to allow pagans free access to the inner court. During this operation he suffered a paralytic stroke, from which he died. Shortly afterward, in the summer of 160, Bacchides returned to Antioch. The sources say nothing about the 2-year period following Bacchides' departure. It may safely be assumed that these years were important for the future of Judea. During this period, Jonathan and his brother Simon undoubtedly strengthened their forces and harassed the men who ruled in Jerusalem, ambushing and punishing those whom they considered friendly to the Syrian government. The leaders in Jerusalem became aware of the growing strength of Jonathan and appealed to Demetrius to send an army finally to defeat Jonathan once and for all. In the year 158, Bacchides again marched with a large army on Judea. The Judeans, who were in sympathy with Syria, promised that they would deliver Jonathan to him. Jonathan and his brother Simon became aware of this and captured 50 of the leaders responsible for Bacchides' invasion and executed them. Lacking an adequate force to withstand the Syrians, they withdrew to a place in the wilderness of Judea called Bet-Bassi, about 3 miles east of Tekoa. Bacchides, learning that the Hasmoneans had occupied Bet-Bassi and fortified it, besieged the place. Jonathan then secretly withdrew, while a number of his men, under the leadership of Simon, stayed to fight in Bet-Bassi. Jonathan now launched expeditions against the neighboring peoples, conquering some of them and seizing their leaders. Many became his allies against Bacchides. Thus Jonathan gathered a considerable number of warriors, and when his force seemed large enough, he struck out against Bacchides from the wilderness, as did Simon from the fortress. Bacchides did not expect such stubborn resistance from Jonathan, nor attacks on 2 fronts, for the Jerusalem leaders had promised an easy victory. He now recognized the difficulty of his task, and realized that success would not be quick or easy. To cover up his unsuccessful attempt to destroy Jonathan and Simon, and to save face, he blamed the leaders at Jerusalem and executed many of them. Jonathan, sensing the differences between Bacchides and his Judean allies, thought this a good opportunity to arrive at the modus vivendi with Bacchides. He sent ambassadors to him with a proposal of peace, eager to return to Antioch. Bacchides accepted the offer. He returned the prisoners whom he had taken and agreed that Jonathan remain as the leader of his group, but would not permit him to reside in Jerusalem. Jonathan had therefore to make his abode in Michmash, modern Mukhmas, about 9 miles north of Jerusalem. He chose Michmash because it was brief. He chose Michmash because it was being fortified. There he could not be easily taken by surprise. After Bacchides left Judea for Antioch, the leaders in Jerusalem no longer enjoyed the undivided support of the Syrian government. Moreover, their position was weakened greatly by the lack of a high priest to lead them, for after the death of Alcimus, none was appointed by the Antiochian government. Jonathan and his followers, for their part, opposed the appointment of a high priest, who would also have civil authority over the people, since the high priest possessed this in addition to his religious authority. Bacchides, who recognized Jonathan's strength, acquiesced in the do-nothing arrangement, so as not to antagonize the Hasmoneans. Jonathan's growing strength was obvious, since he was supported by the rank and file of the Judeans. The failure to appoint a high priest secured his leadership without his being formally recognized by the Syrian government. He began to judge the people and destroy the irreligious out of Israel, according to the author of 1 Maccabees. Following the policy of his brother Judah Maccabee, he persecuted all those who were friendly to the Syrian government and disloyal to the Jewish religion. It may be assumed that the other party in Jerusalem appealed to Demetrius for help, but he was neither in sympathy with them nor in a position to help them. Demetrius had, in 160, after ruling for 2 years, obtained recognition from the Roman Senate as the legitimate king of the Seleucid dynasty. Rome would have preferred a weakling on the throne, but the Senate acquiesced in the situation because it was an accomplished fact. A few years later, Demetrius's hold on the kingdom became rather shaky. The neighboring kings, Attalus of Pergamon and Ariarthes of Cappadocia, and Ptolemy Philometor of Egypt, were envious of him, and therefore hostile. They feared that he would follow the policy of Antiochus the Great in establishing a strong Seleucid kingdom in Syria. Furthermore, they each had a special grievance against him. The kings of Cappadocia and Pergamum hated him for his interference in the internal affairs of Cappadocia. Ptolemy Philometor opposed him because of his scheming to seize the island of Cyprus. Eventually, Attalus discovered in the city of Smyrna a young man named Balus, who bore a marked resemblance to Antiochus Epiphanes. Attalus declared him to be the latter's son, one who, unlike his brother, Antiochus Eupator, had been saved from death when Demetrius ascended the throne. This lad was given the name of Alexander. Sometime between 158 and 156, Attalus placed him close to the Syrian frontier as a threat to Demetrius. Demetrius was very unpopular, even among the populace of Antioch. Having been brought up in Rome, he continued to maintain its standards of Hellenistic culture, regarding with contempt the Syrians who, though Hellenized, remained boorish and crude. He even withdrew from Antioch, and built for himself a castle near the city. As Polybius states, he gave himself to drink and was tipsy for the greater part of the day. Under these circumstances, it was no wonder that the Syrian government could give no help to the leader of Jerusalem who opposed Jonathan. Jonathan and the rival kings. Alexander Belus. In the year 153, the lad Alexander Belus went to Rome accompanied by Heraclides, who had been the former finance minister of Antiochus Epiphanes, but whom Demetrius had later dismissed. Heraclides had further reason for animosity toward Demetrius because he had slain his brother Timarchus. They were joined in Rome by Laodice, the daughter of Antiochus Epiphanes. Laodice knew that Alexander was an impostor and not her brother, but her hatred for her cousin Demetrius and her desire to avenge the death of her brother Antiochus Eupator induced her to conceal the truth. Perhaps, too, Laodice, who was a refugee from Antioch and fearful of being assassinated by the agents of Demetrius, thought it more advantageous for her to recognize Belus as her brother and thus attain power in Antioch. Heraclides appeared before the Roman Senate accompanied by Alexander Belus and Laodice, pleading that Alexander was the legitimate heir to the throne. Most of the senators were aware that the Alexander affair was a hoax. However, they voted to recognize Alexander Belus as king in the following words: Alexander and Laodice, the children of a king who was a friend and ally, came before the Senate and addressed it. The Senate thereupon gave them authority to go home to regain their father's home, and it was decided to grant their request for help. Again, Roman policy followed a single motive: eventual control. Alexander Belus landed in Ptolemais, Acco, in the summer of 152. He probably chose that spot just north of Judea, knowing of the feeling there against Demetrius, and hoping that the Judeans might rally to him. The kingdoms of Egypt, Cappadocia, and Pergamum had already allied themselves with him. Demetrius recognized the danger, and he sought to meet it by granting the Judeans concessions. He sent them a letter addressed to Jonathan, giving him the authority to assemble troops, and ordering that the hostages held in the citadel be set free. Jonathan went to Jerusalem and read this letter to the local authorities. They set the hostages free and returned them to their parents. Jonathan thereupon took up his residence in Jerusalem, and the foreigners who were left in the various fortresses built by Bacchides fled, excepting only those in Betzur and the citadel. Those Judeans who opposed Jonathan also took refuge in these strongholds. When Alexander heard that Demetrius had granted concessions to the Judeans, he sent a personal letter to Jonathan addressed, King Alexander, to his brother Jonathan, greetings. He appointed Jonathan high priest and bestowed upon him the title friend of the king. Alexander obviously recognized Jonathan as a power to be reckoned with. This letter marks a significant moment. The rulers of Palestine had always retained the sole authority to appoint the high priest. The Persian kings had formerly done so, and later, when the country became a part of the Greek empires, the Ptolemies did it. When Antiochus III defeated Ptolemy IV, and Palestine became a part of the Seleucid Empire, the Seleucid rulers appointed the high priest. The last high priest, Alcimus, had been appointed by Demetrius, and now Jonathan was appointed by Alexander Belus. He was the first Hasmonean to be so recognized and first served in the role on the Feast of Tabernacles 152. The reason that he first officiated on this festival instead of on the Day of Atonement was probably that the letter of appointment did not reach him in sufficient time before the Sukkot holiday. There can be no doubt that a considerable segment of the Judeans opposed this appointment. The resistance came from two groups of extremists. One, those who were partly Hellenized and had been followers of Joshua, Jason, Onias, Menelaus, and Alcimus, and the other, the Hasidim, the extremely pious who followed the Pentateuch literally. The Hasidim held that God had made a covenant with Phinehas, the progenitor of the family of Zadok, and therefore they could not recognize as high priest one who was not of that family. Alcimus, the last of the sons of Joseph, could at least claim proper descent on his mother's side, but Jonathan was the first high priest who was in no way of the family of Zadok. This question of family descent also prompted some objection on the part of many Sadducees. Nevertheless, his followers recognized Jonathan as the high priest. Demetrius. When Demetrius heard that Alexander had made some concessions to the Judeans, he sent a rival letter offering yet more generous terms. This letter, however, was not addressed to Jonathan, but directly to the people. Demetrius reminded them of their past loyalty to the Seleucid dynasty and asked them to continue to be faithful to him. Since they had been heavily taxed, he released them from the poll taxes and from taxes on salt, which was obtained from the marshes around the Dead Sea. He also relieved them of the crown tax, a fixed sum which had to be paid to the government, like the Roman tax, the aurum coronarium. He also freed them from taxes on seed and the fruit of trees. He retransferred the 3 Samarian districts, Amphiramah, Lydda, and Ramathaim, which had been annexed to Judea by Alexander the Great, but which had been returned to Samaria by Antiochus Epiphanes. He relinquished his authority over the citadel in Jerusalem and gave it to the high priest, again not mentioning the name of Jonathan. He pledged himself to set free all Judeans who were taken captive by his army during the war, and promised the Judeans many gifts. He dedicated the city of Ptolemais to the temple as its property. This last was not difficult for him to say, since Ptolemais was occupied by the rival king Alexander Balis. There was also a shrewd political motive behind this gift. Ptolemais was Alexander Balis's capital. By presenting this city to the sanctuary of Jerusalem, Demetrius hoped to undermine Alexander's power in Syria, since his very headquarters was thus no longer in a city which was part of Syria. It now belonged to a foreign sanctuary. Further, he declared that the temple in Jerusalem should have the same status as all the official temples in his domain, that it should be recognized as an asylum for any debtor who took refuge there, that he might not be impressed or sold into slavery by a creditor. Demetrius suggested that an army of 30,000 men be enrolled in his service, and he promised to pay them just as he did the Greek mercenaries. He said that he would station some of them in the strongholds of his kingdom, while assigning others as a bodyguard in his own palace. He also promised to allow these Judean mercenaries to follow the Judean laws as they were maintained in Judea. According to the author of First Maccabees, the Judeans did not believe Demetrius's promises, for they were overly lavish. Moreover, Jonathan rejected Demetrius's offers and joined Alexander because Demetrius's letter was not addressed to him and made no concessions to him. Jonathan then was certain that Demetrius made all these promises because of the critical situation and would not keep his word if he emerged victorious. Besides, it seemed clear that Demetrius had no chance whatsoever of victory. The kings of Egypt, Cappadocia, and Pergamum were allied against him, and he had little popular support, even in his own kingdom. Ptolemy Philometor dispatched an army from Egypt in support of Alexander. There is a likelihood that the Cappadocian and Pergamum forces penetrated into Syria from the north. Thus Alexander mustered a great army with the help of his confederates. Demetrius sent two of his sons, Demetrius and Antiochus, with a great amount of gold to friends out of the country. In the battle which ensued between the forces of the confederates and Demetrius, he was at first victorious, but in the end his army was defeated and he was slain. According to Josephus, his horse fell into a swamp from which it could not emerge, and he was attacked there and killed. In Alexander Baelus's service. In the spring of 151, Alexander Baelus became king of Syria and Babylonia. He sent an embassy to Egypt requesting an alliance with Ptolemy and also sought his daughter Cleopatra in marriage. Ptolemy replied in the following words: "Fortunate was the day when you returned to the land of your fathers and sat upon the throne of their kingdom." Ptolemy undoubtedly knew that Alexander was not the son of Antiochus Epiphanes, but he officially declared him such, and hence the legal heir of the Seleucids, since he wanted to give him his daughter in marriage. Ptolemy further said that he was happy to become his father-in-law, and that he and his daughter Cleopatra would come to Ptolemais for the marriage ceremony. The wedding ceremony took place in the summer of 151. Among the honored guests was the high priest Jonathan, who was received by the king with great respect. At the same time, a delegation of opponents of Jonathan came from Jerusalem to bring accusations against him, but the king gave them no audience, and conspicuously displayed his affection for Jonathan by showing him great marks of friendship. He gave him the title of chief friend, and appointed him civil and military head of Judea. The Greek garrison, however, remained in the citadel of Jerusalem as a symbol of subjugation. In due course, Cleopatra gave birth to a male child, who was named Antiochus. Alexander proved an incompetent king. The administration of the government was in the hands of two military leaders, Diodotus and Hierax, who had deserted Demetrius. Alexander himself led a voluptuous life, and paid no attention to the affairs of government. He became most unpopular in Antioch. This was disclosed to the friends of Demetrius I in Asia Minor, and they organized an army of mercenaries in the name of the boy Demetrius, the elder son of the former king. This army first set foot in northern Syria in the year 148. Learning of the invasion, Alexander returned to Antioch to organize an army, but many of his generals were no longer loyal to him. A great defection also occurred in the southern part of his kingdom. Apollonius, the governor of Coele, Syria, deserted Alexander for the young Demetrius. Jonathan, however, continued to be faithful to Alexander. Apollonius, who became the representative of Demetrius, warned Jonathan of the consequences of his stubborn adherence to Alexander, and threatened him with war. Jonathan accepted the challenge and gathered an army of 10,000 men. He put part of his army under the command of his brother Simon, and he himself marched to the city of Jaffa on the coast where Apollonius had a garrison. When he encamped against the city, the inhabitants opened the gates, and he took possession of it. Hearing that Jonathan and his men were in Jaffa, Apollonius marched his army with a considerable force of cavalry to the city of Ashdod, and Jonathan hurried after him. Apollonius left a part of his army hidden in the valley in order to ambush Jonathan from the rear. Jonathan learned of this maneuver and was prepared for it. The battle lasted an entire day. When the men and horses were spent, Jonathan's reserves under Simon launched an attack, concentrating on the infantry. Apollonius's army was defeated in this way and scattered in the plain, the remnants fleeing to Ashdod. Jonathan took the city and burned it together with the temple of Bet-Dagon. He then marched against the city of Ashkelon. The citizens offered no resistance, but received him with acclaim. Jonathan took most of the cities on the Mediterranean coast and stationed garrisons there when he left. He did not annex the cities to Judea, having conquered them in the name of Alexander Belus. Alexander Belus, without any effort on his part, had thus won a great victory over Demetrius. When Alexander heard of Jonathan's victories, he raised him to the highest estate, bestowed on him the title of kinsman, and sent him a clasp of gold. The right to wear a clasp of gold was restricted to very distinguished persons. He also presented to him the city of Ekron, modern Acre, as a personal possession. Ptolemy Philometor, Alexander Belus's father-in-law, decided that he must intervene in the struggle between the two rival kings, Demetrius and Alexander Belus. He came up from Egypt with a large army accompanied by his daughter Cleopatra, and captured all the coastal cities. The sources are at variance as to the purpose of this intervention. Diodorus and Josephus say that it was in support of his son-in-law Alexander against Demetrius. However, when Ptolemy learned that his son-in-law had plotted to kill him, he turned against him. First Maccabees gives a different version. It says that originally he had planned to seize the country for himself, and he deceived the garrisons and inhabitants into believing he had come to assist his son-in-law, and that it was for this reason they welcomed him. When Ptolemy came to Ashdod, its inhabitants complained to him against Jonathan because of the cruelties he had done them and the burning of their temple. Ptolemy remained silent. He did not want to commit himself. Since on the surface he seemed to be acting in behalf of his son-in-law Alexander, he could not condemn Jonathan, who had punished the inhabitants for their rebellion. In fact, Ptolemy was at war with his son-in-law and contemplated annexing the cities to his realm. When Ptolemy reached Jaffa, Jonathan paid him a cordial visit and was well received by him. Ptolemy continued up the coast, leaving behind him a garrison in every city he visited. When he came to Seleucia, about 50 miles southeast of Antioch, he openly broke off his relations with his son-in-law. The reason he gave was that Alexander had schemed to kill him. This accusation convinced many people and has been accepted by historians. From Seleucia, Ptolemy sent word to Demetrius, informing him that he had done and from Seleucia, Ptolemy sent word to Demetrius, informing him what he had done and also that he had taken back his daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's wife. Demetrius was still a lad of 15 years. Ptolemy, nevertheless, now offered the hand of his daughter to the boy Demetrius, and wrote to him that he would be pleased to have him as his son-in-law. Alexander was at the time either in the field crushing the revolt against him, or had fled to Cilicia, as has been maintained by some sources. Ptolemy entered the city of Antioch, where he was warmly welcomed. His army held possession of the entire coast from Egypt to Seleucia. Undoubtedly, he recalled the great humiliation which he had experienced as a result of the invasion of Egypt by Antiochus Epiphanes. Only the fear of Rome had prevented Antiochus from annexing Egypt. Ptolemy now had the power to annex Syria to Egypt. Again, the fear of Rome was the deterrent. The Antiochians, however, proclaimed him king, thus making him the sovereign of both Asia and Africa. Josephus maintains that the people compelled him to become king of Syria, though he demurred, both because he was not ambitious and because he did not want to give offense to the Romans. It is impossible to determine where the truth lies. It is likely, however, that Ptolemy's ambition was underestimated. He had known all along that Alexander was not the son of Antiochus Epiphanes, yet he gave him his daughter because he had hoped to dominate Syria through him. This design, apparently, not succeeding, he turned against his son-in-law Alexander. Since Demetrius was a boy, Ptolemy now thought he could dominate Syria by making him king and his son-in-law. When Alexander learned that Ptolemy was in Antioch and was to be proclaimed king through the treachery of some of his generals, he assembled an army against him. The two armies met on the banks of the Oanoparis River, in the plain before the city of Antioch. Alexander's army was defeated, and he himself fled to Arabia for shelter. There he was killed by Zebelius, an Arab prince who cut off his head and sent it to his former father-in-law, Ptolemy. According to other sources, however, Alexander was killed in the battle with Demetrius. Still other sources say he was killed by his own officers. Ptolemy also was seriously wounded, and himself died a few days later. Many of the inhabitants of Syria recognized that Ptolemy had been an invader who planned to annex Syria and Egypt. His alliances, first with Alexander and then with Demetrius, disguised his real purpose. With the death of Ptolemy, the Egyptian army was left without a leader, and the Syrians slaughtered the Egyptians in revenge. After the death of Alexander Belus, in the year 146, Demetrius, the son of Demetrius I, was acknowledged king. End of part 1.